Welcome back, America. I doubt I will enjoy two segments more this year than what I'm about to do. And indeed, for the next few weeks, my guest, Admiral James Stavridis, retired United States Navy, and I will be talking about his brand new bestseller, Sailing True North 10 Admirals and the Voyage of Character. Sailing True North is in bookstores everywhere. It's at Amazon. I just tweeted it out, and I'll be talking about it for a few weeks because I don't want to rush. I think this is important stuff. Admiral Stavridis, welcome back. It's always a pleasure to talk to you.
My pleasure to be on with you, Hugh, and thanks for playing the music Sail Away as the segment started.
Well, 9.5 years in deep ocean. I've often said to people, based upon your previous books, that you spent 11 years at sea. But in this book, in the introduction, you narrow it down to 9.5 in deep ocean. That means out of sight of land, right?
Correct. The difference is coastal waters. So 11 years, day for day, aboard a ship at sea, and 9.5 years out of sight of land, deep ocean.
So this is at least your fourth book. And this is the one that I think every ninth grader in America ought to be assigned to read, no matter what they know about or don't know about the ocean. Is it fourth or fifth?
Hugh, this is actually my ninth book. and yeah, but the difference is 4 of those books are books about the ocean and watch standing. They're kind of naval guide books. So in terms of broad audience spectrum, this is really my 5th book.
Well, let me tell you what you might find to be interesting. Everyone's going to have a different reaction to Sailing True North. And you know the Frank Lentz rules. You got to say the book's title 7 times in any segment or no one will remember Sailing True North. There is a bit in here about journalism. I don't know if you knew that you wrote about journalism. Did you know you wrote about journalism?
Of course I knew I wrote about journalism.
Herodotus and Thucydides, their separate approaches and biases led them to draw quite different conclusions about Themistocles. And I wrote a note there in the margin saying, this is every journalist in America on Trump, every journalist in America on Obama, every journalist everywhere about every dynamic leader. It all depends. You see what you see depending on where you sit.
It's so true. And Themistocles is the first admiral that we're introduced to of the 10 admirals in this voyage of character. And he's a complicated character. He's somebody who is full of charisma. He's a powerful speaker. He's a dynamic leader. He's utterly decisive. On the other hand, that creates a lot of antibodies in the system in Athens, where he is centered. He leads the Athenian navy to an extraordinary victory in the Bay of Salamis, just off the coast of Athens, and defeats the Persians, today's Iranians. He stops them in their tracks and saves Greece from a Persian invasion. Yet after all of this, he's ultimately rejected by the police, by the city of Athens, and goes into exile. So a complicated character, a good place to start a book about character.
Now, you call him a scorched earth leader. What do you mean by scorched earth leader?
That everything to Themistocles was black and white, that he took no prisoners. If he were Cortez, he would have burned the ships of his expedition, so his troops had no way back. Themistocles was the ultimate binary choice kind of leader, and he was the kind of leader you need in moments of extreme existential crisis. That's why we include him at the beginning of Sailing True North.
Now, I thought it was interesting because a lot of Themistocles' history depends upon those two sources, Herodotus and Thucydides. But there are legends, and you're not afraid of legends in telling this book. Why not?
Because at the end of the day, what composes the narrative of our lives are the legends we build. And those are the result of character, about that inner voyage that we sail. You know, Hugh, we're awash in books on leadership, how to influence others. This ultimately is a book about how you lead yourself on that inner voyage. And that's what creates the legend that echoes and becomes an example for others.
I'm going to come back to the personal story you tell about your dad and how you got into Themistocles, but I want to pause for a moment. These are about admirals, and obviously you were going to have the most simpatico with them because of your 9.5 years in the deep water and your 30-plus years in the United States Navy. But I was hoping to see something about Alcibiades in this because, and I always mispronounce his name, because Stephen Pressfield wrote those 2 books about him. And I've always thought him to be the most fascinating rogue, and Themistocles turns out to have been sort of his role model for being a rogue and going over to the other side.
He was very much so, and here we're diving deep into ancient Greek history. But Alcibiades, of course, was so ingrained with Sicily and the movement of Greece to conquer and colonize Sicily, which really was foundational in the creation of the Roman Empire. The reason I went with Themistocles, you nailed it, is because of the ocean, because of the sea, because he was an admiral. I easily could have included Alcibiades, who was a rogue. Kind of another admiral who comes along later, of course, is Sir Francis Drake, who was kind of the pirate admiral. So you see again and again in these 10 admirals from history different qualities of character, and I think that that's what makes Sailing True North the book that it is.
One of the things that, I'm making a list of personal remarks. There are remarks throughout Sailing True North that people are supposed to, I think, write down and internalize. Refuse to be swept up in the mood of the moment. And that's very hard to do. You and I disagree about the Turkish situation, but I tried to begin the show by saying, talk to me in 5 years and I'll tell you how this works out, because the mood of the moment is completely critical of Trump, right? It's just devastating of Trump's decision. And the mood of the moment is very anti-Trump. And I just try always to understand what your first principles are and stay anchored. That is, and there's a nautical reference, that's your first lesson. Don't get swept up.
It's so true. And to leap ahead in the list of admirals, let's park for a moment on Chester Nimitz. So Admiral Nimitz is a rising four-star when Pearl Harbor happens. Obviously, Admiral Kimmel, who is in command of the Pacific Fleet, is fired, and Nimitz gets the call. So Nimitz shows up at Pearl Harbor after crossing the country, and he looks at this beautiful, glittering Pacific Fleet, and it's smoking hulks in the water. It's battleships that are sunk, thousands of sailors dead. You can smell the cordite in the air. And he takes command of the Pacific Fleet, Hugh. Here's the basic principle thought. Takes command of the Pacific Fleet, not in his service dress whites, his choker whites, standing on the deck of a beautiful battleship. He can't even get on the deck of a carrier. They're out at sea trying to dodge the Japanese. He takes command of the Pacific Fleet as it's in ruins around him on the deck of a diesel submarine, the smallest ship in the fleet. And he's wearing rumpled set of khakis. And that is a moment of resilience. That is a moment when you reach inside yourself, you know your first principles. That's what Admiral Nimitz did. And I think he did not get swept up in the mood of the moment, which was one of extreme defeatism. Instead, he resolutely led the fleet into the Second World War.
Now, there is a tie between Chester Nimitz, and I've been to his hometown, which is in the middle of Texas, where the Museum of the War in the Pacific. Why would the Admiral of the Great Blue Ocean Sea come from Fredericksburg? I don't know. And I don't know a lot about Nimitz. I've learned Nimitz from your book. But what I loved was that when you went to China for the first time, you would toast Zhang He, who we're about to talk about. And the Chinese would respond with a toast to Nimitz. And what they have in common is vast calm. CALM for the Steelers fans out there. Vast calm. Explain first the toasting, and then let's talk a little bit about. I first learned about Zhang He from Stanley McChrystal's book, and I actually had never heard of him in my life until I read McChrystal's book. And now he shows up in McChrystal's book, Kissinger's book, and your book, and I'm thinking this is a key to a lot to understand this guy.
Yeah, he was a captive who was captured in a series of wars between China and Mongolia, as was often the case in those days. He was captured as a 10-year-old boy. He was castrated, so he becomes a eunuch. Then he, however, overcomes this adversity, pretty extreme adversity, and rises through the ranks and eventually becomes the leading advisor to the emperor, and is chosen to build an enormous fleet of Chinese ships which sweep across the South China Sea into the Indian Ocean and effectively move China's trade and economic weight out into the world. It's extremely reminiscent, Hugh, of course, of what China is trying to do today with the One Belt, One Road strategy, creating economic dominance where it goes. So the thing I love about Zheng He is that he was a builder. He constructed this fleet himself. These are the largest wooden structures built by man. Some of these ships, they're 500 feet long with crews of 400 during a period of time that Christopher Columbus is sailing in tiny ships, a tenth that size, to discover America. So he is a historical figure, but one also of calm and organizational abilities. That's why he and Nimitz are sort of paired in my mind. That's why he's an iconic figure to the Chinese Navy, the way that Nimitz is an iconic figure to the American Navy.
I want to underscore to Americans, especially who are listening this morning, to understand the People's Republic of China right now and what we are up against and dealing with and co-evolving alongside of. You have to understand Zhang He, and Admiral Stavridis has done a terrific job introducing him. His first voyage is in 1405. It involves 700 of those wooden ships the Admiral just described, which are vast, 27,000 sailors. And if you don't know how far he went, I thank you for this detail, which I had not picked up. I kind of got that he went across the ocean to India, and I was thinking it was a back and forth. He went to Kenya. I mean, these guys went everywhere.
It's an extraordinary story. And of course, this is almost a century before Christopher Columbus discovers America.
Yeah.
And so when I think of China, it helps me understand the way China looks at itself. And this is another element of character, is that ability to study, to reflect, to truly understand another culture, and then empathy, to put yourself in their place. So as we look, Hugh, today at the South China Sea and China's claims, we don't agree with them. We think they violate current international law. I believe that. On the other hand, China looks at it very differently because of these voyages. They look at it as a historical claim they have over the South China Sea. We need to understand that, even as we need to confront China in terms of current international law.
Now, the 9-dash line, is that a Zhang He legacy? Is that where that comes from?
Absolutely. And it is fundamental to the Chinese claims as they have laid them out in the international courts. And, there is an element of international law which is respectful of historical claims. On the other hand, there are other balancing features in international law, including the rights of territoriality of all the other nations that surround the South China Sea, all of whom get their 200-mile exclusive economic zone. So China's claims are understandable, but they are not going to determine how this one comes out.
And Admiral Stavridis, before I switch to Zumwalt at the end here, because I want to make sure in our first conversation about sailing true north, we cover both the beginning and the end of the book. We'll fill in the middle the next time. I'm curious about whether or not the analogy of the Caribbean to the South China Sea cuts it with you. Let's cut some steel, as you say. I love that new phrase. I got a new phrase from the Navy, cut some steel. Let's get right down to it and make some noise. Is there a parallel between our claims to domination in the Caribbean Sea to the Chinese claims to domination in the South China Sea?
I think there's a crucial difference. China claims the South China Sea as territorial sea, meaning that they would have utter sovereign control over it. They would have the right to construct those artificial islands. They would have the right to take oil and gas from it. They have the right to control any shipping that crosses it. They claim it as territorial sea, the way that we claim the 200 miles along our coastline. That is not how we look at the Caribbean. We look at the Caribbean as high seas when it's outside the 200 miles around us, the 200 miles around all the island nations of the Caribbean. We're respectful of the international aspects of the Caribbean in ways that China is not in the South China Sea.
All right, now I want to switch to Zumwalt. And the background of this is you've served a lot of SecNavs, Secretaries of the Navy, including Secretary of the Navy Richard Danzig. I know Modley, who's the Undersecretary. I know Spencer is the Secretary. I know Dino Aviles pretty well. I know a bunch of these guys who've been there. But to be the Sec Navy is a big deal. And your SecNav really introduced you to Zumwalt. Explain the Zumwalt story and explain Danzig and his impact on your career.
So Richard Danzig was the Secretary of the Navy back in the Democratic administration a few years back, and he chose me to be his executive assistant, essentially his chief of staff. So I was settling into my desk there as a captain in the U.S. Navy. I just come from being a Commodore commanding a group of ships in the Pacific and in the Persian Gulf. So I'm back in the Pentagon. I'm trying to find my coffee cup, and in walks this silver-haired gentleman with extremely prominent eyebrows, and I look up, and of course I recognize Admiral Elmo Zumwalt, who was an extraordinary chief of naval operations in the early 1970s. He leaped over every four-star and almost every three-star in the Navy to become the chief of naval operations. Very controversial choice, but he walked in the door and said, "You and I share something, Captain Stavridis. We share this desk." And it turns out that he had been the executive assistant, the chief of staff, many years earlier to a previous Secretary of the Navy, Paul Ignatius. And so we formed a bond. He gave me a signed copy of his memoir, On Watch, which I commend highly. And he became a kind of a mentor to me in that job, in that role. And that helped shape me later in life as a four-star admiral to have had that encounter with Admiral Zumwalt.
Now, you say you drop a plumb line from transition to the reform back to Elmo Zumwalt. His legacy lives on. What is that legacy, and what does the Navy need it today?
His legacy, above all, was listening to the sailors. Until Zumwalt came along, the Navy was a relentlessly, utterly traditional, hierarchical organization. And of course, all militaries are chain of command driven. But what Zumwalt taught us was that you have to listen to the deck plates. You have to understand what the sailors are thinking. You have to listen to the chief petty officers, and that they are not going to determine policy for the Navy, but their voices have to be heard. And if you think of the 70s, this was sort of part of what was happening in the country as well. So this idea of reaching out, understanding what the sailors on the deck plates are thinking as you construct policy for the Navy today is a true legacy of Elmo Zumwalt. And the second thing, he was an innovator. He was willing to try new things. He put very junior officers in command of bigger ships. He tried all different kinds of new technologies. He had innovation, and that latter quality, I think, is what is somewhat lacking today, and where we need more emphasis in the Navy is a willingness to change. That, I think, is the ultimate legacy of Admiral Zumwalt. That was in his character.
More on Sailing True North next week with Admiral James Stavridis. I've tweeted it out. Go and get it. It is called Sailing True North at Amazon.com. Timely book for everyone who wants to lead today. Thank you, Admiral.
Thanks so much, Hugh. Talk again soon.
Now, I've been talking with Admiral Stavridis. I want to go back and give Adam a second or two. I talked through the break so that we wouldn't break it up. And that's because whenever I post these as a